Action Avenue. And before we jump into it, we would like you to give a brief introduction of yourself.
I'm Miriam Waltz, and I'm very happy to be here. Thanks so much for being interested in my ideas and my work. I'm very glad to have this discussion and exchange of ideas. I'm an architect living in Tel Aviv. So my ideas are very much influenced by design and architecture and built environment thinking. So I think a lot about materials, spaces, places, people, communities, forms, and structures. And I see that as one topic that speaks to each other.
Yeah, that's really nice. So what have you been working on? The piece that you submitted for the Urban Action Avenue is titled as 10 Billion Voices. So yes. What is it about? Tell us about that.
So, as I said, as an architect, I'm very interested in scale and dimensions and the sizing of things. And the beginning of the article, of course, I lay the foundation with the Sustainable Development Goals. So those are very important looking forward as a vision for the future that we are building as a planet and a population together. So it's like a language that is looking into the future. Soon, by the middle of this century, we're projected to be 10 billion people. That's a lot of people on this planet. I believe that there's enough room for everybody. And I think that what interests me very much is figuring out how to fit 10 billion people, not just in terms of the space they take up and the resources they use, but also in the voices, in their participation in making this planet a home for everybody.
Yeah, that's a good point. I remember you specifically talk about representation, and you said a system of representation is needed. So will you shed some light on that?
So yes, I believe that representation and space is very connected. There are many systems in place now in the planet that I feel are a good basis for everything, because obviously we have systems of representation that are focused more on localities, and systems of representation like the UN that is looking at the global system as a whole. However, I feel that there are some connections that are missing and that they could help with our tackling climate change, and that the connection between representation and locality has to be based very much on resources and on space and location. So I'm very interested and influenced by the idea of the 15-minute city. So that is looking at how, and because of the COVID, we have had that forced into our experience, that we need to be more aware of what is around us. So the 15-minute city is the idea of building our lives in such a way that we can walk to a lot of the places that we need, which includes all of which includes work and education and all of the services and amenities that we need. So the system of representation in 10 billion voices is looking at both the planet as a whole and this idea of the 15-minute city, and how you would build a efficient and useful density of people in order to build communities from the bottom up,
Right.
and how the spatial sizing of the community can have a direct partnership with the representation and with the people that become leaders on different scales of the sizing of the representation. So if you would look at the size of this 15-minute city, I live in Tel Aviv, and it's a really nice scale of a city, where you can feel that it's almost like a neighborhood, it almost has a village size feeling, but it's very metropolitan as well. So if you look at the density of the city, it's about 8,000 people per square kilometer. And now the 10 billion voices idea has the idea that it would be 1,000 people per 15-minute city, which would equate the equivalent of about 8,000 people per kilometer square. So I'm looking at Tel Aviv as this kind of ideal density for a city. However, obviously what's missing is this neighborhood representation, where you really are connected far more with your neighbors than you are now. Every home now is considered its own entity, but I'm looking at neighborhoods as actually communities as well, so that even within the scale of a building, each floor, let's say, has one representative per 10 people, and then each building has their representative, and then each pair of buildings, and then each 1,000 people 15-minute city would also have their representative, and then each representative would represent their smaller group in the larger group.
Right.
Yes.
So yeah, sorry, I was just going to ask you, when did you start working on this, and how did you come up with this idea?
Well, I can't really say when I started working, because it's a lot of ideas that have taken a lot of time. I'd say that with what I'm influenced by greatly is in architecture school, I learned about a book called Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander. That one is a very strong.
It's quite fascinating.
Influence. Yeah. Because it really describes how the smallest detail is connected to the largest detail. Another work that influenced me very greatly in terms of thinking about the connections between things and scales is a film by Charles and Ray Eames called Powers of 10. It's a very short film, and it's so precise in describing, just through image, zooming in to a couple having a picnic at a lakeside, and then zooming out to the level of the galaxy and the universe, and then back down again. So from Powers of 10, you really learn about scale, and you learn how quickly one can get into a large scale and into a small scale. And when I say quickly, I mean you just add a zero, you add a zero, you add a zero, you add a zero, and then you're the size of the universe. And those steps of just adding a zero are quite small steps, but they're huge as well. So that's what influenced me very much with regards to believing that there's room for everything. And in the work that I've written, I give also biblical examples because I feel that those are traditions that go way back, and that there are important hidden sources of knowledge within those old texts, no matter what you believe where they came from.
Yeah, and that is true when you actually go back to such mythological texts or historic books even, you find certain examples which are still relevant, maybe in a different context, maybe at a different scale, but yeah, a lot of it is still relevant. And that's a really good example that you also stated in your written article. So in your article, yes, you you start with talking about the sustainable development goals and how all of that needs to be a collective responsibility. So and you rightly explain that voices at different level exponents and you become part of the universe and everyone has a role to play. So I think in your work, this resources and tools that can be used also play a major role, and you gave an example as well. So would you talk about that?
When you say resources and tools, you mean the technology that exists
Yeah, the
in the.
steps and the technology and like yeah, what needs to be done.
Yeah, well, I believe that all the technology exists for us to make a happy, pleasurable planet for everybody. Um, I think that this dialogue between being local and global at the same time is the key to the future. So, with regards to tools, I think that it can come from the top down and the bottom up. So, for instance, I think that the UN is a very important an important body to influence from the top down, because it has an overview of
Yeah.
everything. Um, in the article 10 billion voices, I use the water systems as an example for how one would divide the different constituencies of responsibility. And I believe that with the systems like GIS, all the mapping that is needed to really understand our water systems and how it relates to the size of populations and the water usage, and the amount of rainfall and the amount of water that flows from one place to the next, from upstream and downstream. I think all that information already exists, and perhaps the UN is already collating it. But I think that what really needs to be understood is how much population is dependent on what water sources, basically, and to really understand it spatially. Because I mean, I do believe that cultures and languages are very important, but I am less interested in national boundaries. And the national boundaries as they exist now are, of course, they're also dependent on geographical boundaries and on resources. But as history has created itself, it's basically on who gets where first, rather than on how we share the resources for everybody's good. So building a dam might help your people, but it won't help the people that are further downstream. So really, we need to see everybody as part of one big family. And I think that the UN can help us map it, basically, with the information that is necessary to understand who is using what and who needs what upstream and downstream. With regards to from the bottom up, I think that also local governments can help determine local boundaries more in terms of these 15-minute cities, and many cities are doing that as well. They're really working, and I think that's really encouraging and interesting. I also think that from a private technology point of view, all the applications that are being invented, there are so many different types of social networking possibilities that can be curated, let's say, because I'm sure that they already exist. That's what I write at the end of the articles. I think that everything has already existed. Every time, if you have a random idea about any app, you Google it and somebody's done it. So basically, I'm interested in how you bring the social network into a more spatial understanding, so that you're building these social networks also within your neighborhood, and then within your city scale, and then with your state scale. So yeah, I think apps and mapping. And then I think that the representation part, it will unfold naturally once you have people understanding their location and what their impact on what their impact is on resources. And once you start making an emphasis on community, people will want to take part much more in being responsible and making where they live beautiful.
I was actually also intrigued with the fact that you actually gave an example of water bodies, because that is not so often done. So would you just briefly explain the example that you actually explained in the article, and how the collective responsibility and representation works?
With regards to water bodies?
Yeah. So how you used it? Yeah.
I drew a few maps for the work, and one of them is looking at the ocean and the oceans as one large basin. And this I was inspired by an artist and thinker called Peter Fend, who has a project called Ocean Earth, where he really looks at everything as one system. And now, if you look at the land masses within that body of water, every landmass has these tentacles of water that are feeding into the oceans. So I was thinking to split the world into, first of all, from the top down via the UN and bigger voices, into ocean federations. So instead of looking at the continent as a land mass, you look at the continent as the tentacles of water that are flowing into the ocean. So any land mass whose water is flowing into a particular basin will be that continent, basically. So you're looking at it the other way around. Mm-hmm. You're looking at where the water comes from in order to go into the ocean. And then, of course, there's rain as well. So rain is also part of the system because it circulates the water around the planet in a way that the earth can digest it without the saltiness of the ocean. So there's I've forgotten his name now. I know his alias. It's Grasshopper. There's this amazing cartographer who calls himself Grasshopper, and I don't remember his real name, but he has these amazing maps of the earth where he shows all of the rivers and all of the water basins around the planet. So you see it as if it's like veins around the planet.
Yeah.
And so you can, when you're looking at these veins, you can see what areas are connected to what other areas with regards to the way that the water flows.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that this is how we should divide our let's say governmental organizations should be divided within the lines of what water flows into what areas. And it can be, it starts off as the ocean, and then it can get into smaller and smaller areas of responsibility, which are similar to the scales of governmental organization now, but just that each area is very much aware of what's happening to the water. For instance, where I live now, there's they don't necessarily call it a rainy season, but it's in the winter there's a lot of rain, and in the summer there's no rain. In the winter, the cities are flooding because they have not been planned according to the water.
Right.
If you would organize the government according to water, there would be no way that you would plan a city without thinking, first of all, where does the water flow? And from that, everything can develop onwards, because we ourselves are a high percentage of water. Water is the thing that we cannot live more than 3 days without. I mean, air is the first thing, that is the first priority, then is water, and then is food, and then is shelter. So water is the thing that we need to focus on when we are making our plans, basically.
So yeah, like you said, you're not entirely focusing on the geographical boundaries, but you're focusing on how we can divide it based on the oceans and the streams that connect.
Yes, and the watersheds and the water basin.
Yeah. Yes. So how do you think would that change the working environment in terms of when we talk about collective responsibility? So how do you think that will make situation different from what it is now?
Well, I think that we wouldn't see water just as like the things that we need in order to survive daily. We say we need water, and we imagine water as 2 1.5 liter bottles to drink, and then the water we need to flush the toilet, the water we need to wash our clothes. The factories, we don't even think about the factories, because we just care about what we need on a daily basis. So thinking about water will make, or thinking about where the source of water and where it's going will really open up our eyes to how everything is created. Because I think water is how everything is connected. That's what I wanted to say. Created and connected. I think that we won't be able to ignore how everything is connected when we're looking at actual streams and the way that is that a bit, is that precise enough?
I was actually going to ask you to touch upon how that scenario that you just described, that people being aware of water flow, and that does influence how we live because a lot of things change. So how do you think this whole idea of introducing representation, introducing collective responsibility, touching it, looking at it from a perspective of zones divided based on water bodies, how do you think all
Mhm.
of that can lead to the can impact the community at large, and for the betterment of the community, how what is the impact in terms of community development?
Well, there's another important point with regards to how I wrote about the how one collects revenue.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm not calling it taxes because taxes is a word which also removes the purpose of taxes. The purpose of tax is to have a common pot of money where we can redistribute the wealth basically so that everybody has enough.
Yeah.
So I'm calling it public revenue instead. Um, and I'm saying that public revenue should come via the rent of land, which would be divided by these communities, rather than by anything else such as income or VAT. Basically, public revenue should be created by that which is finite and that which belongs to everybody. So I think that is another prerequisite in order to create the understanding of locality, because until we become responsible for our resources rather than the corporation or whatever owner of the land is responsible, until we gain the let's say the title, the land deed as a collective responsibility, it will always be somebody else's fault. It will always be this corporation which should be responsible for cleaning up the neighborhood. And then on the other side, the corporation says, but we don't live there.
Yeah.
The landlord, we don't live there. How can we be responsible for a place that we don't live? So basically the person responsible and the person that lives there, it has to be the same person in order for us really to make an impact. So I believe in collective ownership of land, but it doesn't mean that there wouldn't be a market of land, because there are always places that are more desirable than others, and those more desirable places, the person who lives on it will have to contribute more to society. If they're using a more desirable area or a more desirable resource, they will have to contribute more to everybody, because that's only fair.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like you take responsibility for your actions, but you also sort of indirectly take responsibility for how your actions impact others in the neighborhood and in the larger community. Yeah. So the next question is arbitrary in the sense that obviously I do not expect you to have a perfect answer, but what do you think is the way to go about it if we want to bring this change and sort of the idea of collective responsibility in the citizens today? How do we do that? How do we change the mindset? How do we approach the authorities as well? And how do we move ahead?
Yeah, well, I don't believe in violent revolution. I don't think that violence helps to promote causes, and I think that the path that we're on, although it's very scary, what's happening with climate change, I think that there are so many hopeful. There are a lot of hopeful signals that things are moving in the right direction. But as the topic of the discussion is called accelerating urban action, we do need to find a way to make it quicker, that's for sure, because things may be going in the right direction, but perhaps at a much too slow pace. During the COP26, which I was watching online, I came across this group called Global Assembly. And I thought that was a really impressive initiative, and also showed the importance of representation and hearing voices from every single corner of the planet. So how do we do that? I mean, we talked about the tools from the bottom and from the up, and I think that the tools are still important, but I do believe that a lot of work has to be done from the bottom up by the people themselves, and I think that one can start. One doesn't have to do the whole planet in one sweep, although some of the things that I write about migration and at the end of the article, that's a fully open migration, which is my dream, where anybody can live anywhere on the planet, is only really possible when the whole planet is a good place to live.
Yeah.
Because otherwise migration is just stimulated by war and famine and economic problems. I believe that when everything is more organized in an equal and just way, that migration can be completely free without it being necessary, because you could just stay where you're born, because where you're born will be fine, and people will want to stay in their communities and will want to stay with their elders and want to create generations and connections to the land. So saying that, I still believe that one can start from the bottom up with these 10s, 50s, 100s, and 1000s. And it is my fantasy to, at least in my lifetime, to create an example of a 15-minute city with this 1,000 people, community. And I feel that once people, I mean, even though private land ownership exists the way it is, and even though I have this fantasy of public land ownership, one can still create islands of community land ownership if you get these 1,000 people together in different places. You can show an example of how it would work. And I think that social networking can build it first on a theoretical level to connect people virtually, but then you would start to connect them also physically, and even neighborhoods could even have their own source of income, because once you start to think of really the land as being productive and being local, you will have local agriculture, local factories, let's say, local industries, and jobs can start to be created in those localities as well. I think there was another point that I wanted to mention, which I don't know when is the right point to mention it, but it's part of the inspiration as well, is looking at animals, even ants. When you look at what they're doing, they're only trying to eat, basically. But in their activity of trying to eat, they're doing so much more work than just eating. The amount of things that ants carry on their backs is so much more than what they will ever need to eat in their lifetime. And everything that they're doing is some kind of agricultural work. Every animal is either transporting seeds from one place to another, or digging here a little bit, or composting here a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that we as humans, we can do that without it affecting our purpose in life detrimentally. It will have in fact, quite the opposite, that by giving more than we need to eat in our lifetime back into the earth, it will be a lot more fun for us as well to live on this planet. So these local communities I'm completely for urban environments where there's a density of people, but I do believe that by implementing the 10 billion voices idea, you would have local agriculture as well. So systems of food production would be much more local, and your community would be responsible for making food as well, in a way that gives back to the planet, just as the ants do.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's a good topic. Also, to end the conversation, my last question, I would touch upon the same thing as you said, to give back more than what you need. So I would just ask you that, why do you think it is important for everyone, like you said, 10 billion voices, basically what you're saying is that every individual needs to take responsibility, needs to take action. So the question is, why does that matter more and more as the time goes? It's like we are moving at much slower pace, and we know that we have all seen the reports saying if we don't reach 1.5 degree in the next 10 years, we are way beyond savings, I would say. But yeah, so the question is, why this matters so much, why everyone needs to take action, and why the voices matter so much.
Well, whatever we believe comes after our lives or not, if we believe that something exists in our afterlife, we all know that we have a short, limited lifespan in comparison to how much civilization existed before us and exists after us. So really, on one hand, we could say, what does it matter to me? My life is short in comparison to the grand scheme of things. Why do I care if the world implodes
Actually, that is the mindset that people are living with, the majority of the population. Yeah. So yes, so that's why does your idea matter so much?
But on one hand, people perhaps believe that they live forever in a way. It's a strange paradox, because a person that doesn't care about what happens after them is also somebody who feels like they live forever. So, which doesn't make sense. But if we realized that we were more part of a cycle of things, we would want what we are doing now to be pleasurable for everybody. And something that is pleasurable for everybody will be far more pleasurable also for ourselves. So even if we don't care about what happens afterwards, and that everything can go to dust, it's still much nicer to live in a beautiful green planet that has much biodiversity and much cultural diversity and much much pleasure and joy in looking at the connection between all things, that it would be worth it, even just for now, to make the planet a good place.
That is a vision that most of the urban practitioners, and even I suppose a lot of people have this vision, and it would be great if that actually happens and we get to live in that world. But yeah, so the whole idea of 10 billion voices and the article that you wrote, I'm personally so glad that we got to read that, because it was so fresh, and it was so amazing to know that people are actually thinking in unique ways, the way you explained how we can switch from land masses to water masses. I thank you for submitting your piece to the initiative. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I really believe that every single voice counts, that 10 billion is not just it's not a large number. It's like every one voice counts, and every voice has an impact on the whole, and on the whole has an impact on the one as well. And that people don't need to be necessarily told how to live their lives. I think that people know how to make their lives and the lives of their communities good. They just need to be given the chance. And and as we are now, we don't necessarily feel that we have the chance, but I'm saying that once we get the chance, everybody knows the best how to make this planet a good place.
Let's hope for the best, and let's hope that people do take that chance.
Yes.
Yeah. So yes, I think that would be the end of this interview. It was great talking to you.
Okay.
And
I'm looking forward to reading all of the other submissions, because very excited.
We got quite a handful of refreshing ideas, and it was great reading through all of those and compiling several entries. But yeah, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your views.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
And speak to you soon.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.